attempt to find out what went wrong, what variables, for instance, didn't behave exactly as we thought they would behave in an economic model, and if the variables didn't behave correctly, then we'll begin to question the evidence. As instead of adjusting our economic models and economic theories, we try to adjust the evidence. As for example, we know that the free market regime with self-regulation has left us a lot to be desired, but nevertheless, instead of abandoning them, we try to find actually the causes to be somewhere else and perhaps in the evidence. And this is why that in a lecture at London School of Economics early in the spring and also last fall, the Queen of England appeared in one of the lectures and asked, how come with all these brilliant economies no one saw it coming? Well, of course, some of us did see it coming, but we weren't listened to. And I can't help but mentioning one of the people who were associated at the Levy Economics Institute, which, by the way, is on the Berkowitz campus, Hyman Minsky, who was a distinguished economist in his own right and a maverick, because he developed ideas which were different than the mainstream economic thought, which is in his own way, he argued that the system dynamics are inherent in the capitalist economic system to actually encourage instability. In his own words, he said, stability is destabilizing. It means that during stability, there are tendencies and encouragement to undertake risk and risky behavior. So there is the fact that one should not rest assured that if the system is at rest or it is stable, that this is going to continue for a long period of time. Economists also, there's some strand of economists that have sought to find answers in psychology, and primarily wanted to find out what is actually the motivation under uncertainty. And of course the answers weren't actually found, and very, very recently we sort of have developed a new area of endeavor and research, which is emotional finance. Let me just say that I hope that this conference will give us an opportunity to look at the global financial crisis from a different dimension. I only wonder what actually Hannah Arendt would have said had she been alive. And as I understand, she would have completed 100 years. So with that, I want to welcome you again, and I want to ask my colleague Roger Berkowitz to join.
Welcome, all of you, and thank you very much to Dmitri. Despite what he says, it was not all a one-man effort. I want to thank him and also Ton Toy in the Levy Institute that did an amazing amount of work helping me. In addition, the person who helped organize this the most is Mary Streeter over in the development office, and I want to just thank her immensely for her help. The participants would not all be here seated if it weren't for her. And finally, I just do want to mention one. We have a number of people who helped finance the conference. I'm grateful to them all, and they're listed in the program. One in particular is Alex Basilow, a Bard grad of 1971, who actually came to me and said, let's do something on the financial crisis, and then put some money up to help do it. And we wouldn't be here without him as well. So thank you. One of the pleasures for me in organizing these kind of events is the energy that one gets by bringing a lot of smart, thoughtful people together to think about these kind of issues. It's also that for the last 6 months, everywhere I've gone, there's been something to talk about. You go, and I'm organizing this conference, and everyone offers their advice, their thoughts, etc. And I've gotten a lot of theories about what is the intellectual origin of the financial crisis. One friend of mine, an accomplished businessman deeply involved in the housing industry, wrote me when I invited him to come to the conference, and he said, the cause of the crisis is really quite simple, Roger. Cheap money. The combination of low interest rates, lax regulation, financial innovation, and excessive leverage, he said, led to unprecedented speculation. Now, from an economic point of view, I think the cheap money hypothesis is pretty much unassailable. But at a conference on the intellectual origins of the financial crisis, we need to go a bit further. For starters, we might ask, what is cheap money? Cheap money means that money can be borrowed at very little cost. When interest rates are low, those with money have no incentive to keep it in the bank. And when interest rates are low, combined with lax regulations, the chances of successful investments are increased, and incentives for risky speculations are also increased. In an era of cheap money, saving is discouraged and speculation is encouraged. So if cheap money is behind the bubble, what is behind cheap money? And when did the era of cheap money begin? Well, some say it began in 2001. In the aftermath of 9/11, the Federal Reserve reduced the federal funds rate to 1% and kept it there until 2007. And this helped to finance the bubble in the housing industry, which we've heard so much about. However, others say that cheap money began with the free market fundamentalism of the 1980s. This is George Soros' thesis. Globalization, deregulation, and financial innovation, he says, led to an unprecedented increase in leverage and speculation. Credit markets debt in the United States exceeded 350% of GDP in 2007. Limitless and unregulated credit creation helped create a super bubble in asset prices. Still others argue that the epic of cheap money began on August 15th, 1971, the day that the United States abandoned the gold standard. As a fiat currency, the dollar is not backed by any hard assets, and the potential supply of dollars is thus limited only by the imagination and the democratic demand of our citizenry. Another chorus of experts argue that the rise of easy money is rooted in government policies instituted in the wake of the Great Depression of the 1930s. When governments flood markets with easy money in times of economic contraction, well-meaning intervention encourages a moral hazard, incentivizing speculators to employ ever greater amounts of leverage with the expectation that they will profit in good times and be bailed out in bad times. Yet still others would say that the era of cheap money is much older, that it began on May 5th, 1716, the day that John Law founded Law and Company as the National Bank of France. Law's radical innovation was that paper money, as opposed to silver and gold coin, could be printed, and thus the supply of money could exceed the amount of gold and silver upon which its value was based. What this little tour of 300 years of economic history of cheap money tells us is that if cheap money is the economic cause of the financial crisis, and I think it is in some sense, it's an answer that tells us very little. John Stuart Mill, writing amidst the great financial crisis of 1826, argued that cheap money will expand irrationally in times of optimism, inaugurating a vicious cycle of boom and bust. I think similar to what Dmitri was just talking about. Some booms are longer, some busts are deeper, but the boom-bust cycle of cheap money is part of capitalism itself. It's like the tonsils, as Joseph Schumpeter said, you can't just take it out. It's unlike the tonsils that you can take out. Cheap money is part of capitalism. For Mill, this factual unavoidability of crises generated by cheap money was for him an adequate defense of cheap money and of paper money, which is what he was trying to defend in his article. Mill's realist defense, like those defenders today who seek to normalize the financial crisis, harbors a danger, though, and this is where I think our conference comes in. By familiarizing, analogizing, and making understandable the crisis in global finance, the easy money thesis also reconciles us to the crisis. It is all too easy for us today to simply shrug and say that crises are part of capitalism. To do so, to say that the crisis was caused by cheap money, is to say that there's nothing more to say. Such an approach, however, risks thoughtlessness. When the crisis hit, I was teaching The Origins of Totalitarianism, one of Arendt's books, originally called The Burden of Our Times, from which I took the title. Two aspects of the book struck me as having particular relevance to this current crisis. The first is that Hannah Arendt confronted a very similar phenomena writing about totalitarianism as we now confront writing about the financial crisis. Namely, that totalitarianism was being normalized. The world has always known dictators, people said, and Hitler and Stalin were proof positive simply of the continuity of human frailty. Against this view, Arendt argued that it was a mistake to understand totalitarianism as simply a new form of tyranny. Well, for us today, I think, Arendt counseled that instead of trying to understand the crisis in its historical format, we have to comprehend it. And by comprehension, she means something very specific, and I'll just give her definition of it: the unpremeditated, attentive facing up to and resisting of reality, whatever it may be. Right? The attentive facing up to and resisting of reality. Arendt sought to face up to the fact that totalitarianism was now an ever-present danger in our times. Well, following Arendt, our challenge is to think what we are doing amidst the crisis in the global financial system. That means facing up to the inescapable connection between crisis and capitalism, without thereby reconciling oneself to this connection. What is needed, in other words, is facing up to reality without losing our ability to critique and resist that reality. The second part of The Origins of Totalitarianism that jumped out at me was Arendt's focus on imperialism as the most important intellectual foundation of totalitarianism. Now, the root of imperialism for Arendt is that it transfers the economic principle of growth, of unlimited growth, into the political sphere. Imperialism, she says, has its roots in business speculation, specifically the bursting of the bubble in the 1870s in Europe. As national entrepreneurs sought new markets, they enlisted state support for economic expansion. And she says, expansion as a permanent and supreme aim of politics is the central idea of imperialism. The problem we have to understand, though, is that politics is about setting limits. It's about saying, here's one country and here's another. Here's what's right and here's what's wrong. And imperialism, in a sense, destroys politics. And it's the economic quality of imperialism that she argues is a threat to the political order. The confusion of economic and political thinking that she talked about is, of course, rampant today. I refer not only to the CEO presidencies that have recently ended, but to the more general confusion today between prosperity and happiness. We now believe that if we achieve a certain, apparently ever expanding and increasing level of material prosperity, that we will be happy. The welfare state is now inseparably part of democratic capitalism, and politics, to a degree really unimaginable generations ago, let alone centuries ago, now defines the common good as the commonwealth. Not only politics, but also as a matter of personal identity, who we are is defined by economic thinking. Amidst productivity gains that offer unimaginable riches, unimaginable, again, decades only ago, let alone centuries ago, we continue to labor away, and not out of need. Freed from need, and yet deprived of publicly meaningful religious, cultural, civil life and engagements beyond economic concerns, modern economic citizens work in order to consume. Homo sapiens is replaced by Homo economicus. As economic beings, we treat ourselves as consumers. Every consumer is an entrepreneur, the CEO of his personal corporation that invests in the right schooling, training, and universities, all of which promise a certain return on that investment. Even healthcare, as President Obama now reminds us, is justifiable primarily as a good investment in our future prosperity and productivity. The economic foundation of our present worldview is so natural that we rarely today perceive its strangeness. When we hear human rights advocates proclaim that human rights is good for business, as is now often the case, or anti-war activists discourse on the economic costs of war, we forget that in other cultures and in other times, They did not reduce ethical and political issues, and certainly martial issues, to considerations of economic calculus. Our philoeconomism also obscures the fairly obvious fact that a man does not by nature wish to earn more and more money. Right? Take that statement seriously, made 100 and some odd years ago by Max Weber. Let it sink in. Throughout history, men have wanted to live well, they've wanted to be rich, but they have generally sought to avoid work whenever possible. Those who succeeded became aristocrats and paid others to work for them so that they could pursue more meaningful activities of politics, leisure, and pious devotion. So how did Homo economicus overcome man's natural hedonism? How did econocentrism overcome the religious prescriptions against acquisitiveness and the love of money? And how did capitalism emerge as the natural and dominant way of assessing value in the world? The most famous answer to this question is, of course, given by Max Weber in the book The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Put aside for a moment Weber's very controversial historical thesis about Protestantism, a thesis that Leah Greenfeld, who is going to be speaking tomorrow, has brilliantly, I think, adopted and adapted in her book, The Spirit of Capitalism. Put it aside, and at the heart of Weber's account is his claim that the rise of an unnatural and specifically capitalist ethic, namely to earn more and more money and continue working while doing it, is rooted in the increasing rationalization of society, culture, and humanity itself. What capitalist rationality demands is that man act according to the reason of profit and loss. Capitalist rationality is enormously powerful in allocating resources efficiently. It works. Let's not say that it doesn't. But such rationalization is also dehumanizing. Let's not deny that it is. For if man must act rationally, he must abandon his spontaneous feelings, his passions, his instincts, sometimes his compassion and common sense, all of which are rejected as irrational. The great paradox that Weber discovered in capitalism is that the pure rationalism of capitalist activity is also irrational. And yet, the power of capitalist rationality is, it seems, irresistible. The irresistibility of capitalism is part and parcel of, I think, the demand for certainty. We crave certainty in an uncertain world. And capitalism offers a certainty of a balanced ledger and the clarity of profit and loss. Capitalism thus offers objective criteria upon which we can rationally evaluate our decisions. It is this promise of objective certainty that makes capitalism a symptom of what Hannah Arendt calls the homelessness of the modern age. Our world, the world that's defined by the loss of the authority of religion and tradition, is also a world defined by the loss of a spiritual home, in her understanding. Capitalism, namely the social system that defines good and bad, winners and losers, status and power, by clear and objective criteria of salary and wealth, is one way that a homeless humanity sets itself on certain stable foundations. Some of you may have seen yesterday that Calvin Trillin in the New York Times presented a thesis, namely by someone he met at a bar, that the origin of the financial crisis is that smart people have finally come to Wall Street. I think there's no doubt truth to this thesis, and it goes hand in hand with the extraordinary rise of the entire financial and banking industries, which used to be minor parts of the world economy and are now at the very center of the world economy. What needs to be seen, however, is that the reason smart guys have come to Wall Street is not simply because they wanted or needed the second ocean-faring yacht. Rather is that in an era of unbridled capitalism, self-worth and purpose are increasingly determined by nothing other than one's standing in the game of workplace success. When all higher culture and spiritual values are being devalued, the one way that a person can secure meaning and sense in life is through the objective measurement of success that capitalism offers. Our challenge, the burden of our time, is facing up to and also resisting this reality. That our public world has no values outside of those objectively recognizable values of profit and loss. In this sense, the crisis must not merely be seen as an inevitable hiccup in the advance of capitalism. The point is not to solve the crisis, but to think what it tells us about ourselves. It is to this task, to thinking through, facing up to, and resisting the foundational elements of the global financial crisis, that the conference today and tomorrow is dedicated. The speakers I brought, as Dmitri said, are not all economists. In fact, only one is an officially trained economist. They are philosophers, anthropologists, social theorists, economists, public intellectuals, and many of them are businessmen and women. And they share a common link. They are all people who approach the question of the economic foundation of the modern world with a thoughtfulness and an insight that exhibits the best of what Hannah Arendt offers. I truly hope you enjoy the next 2 days. Without further ado, let me invite up our first panel, which is Antonia Grunenberg from Germany, Jerry Cohn from New York, and Tracy Strong from San Diego, California, along with Marina Van Zwelen from Bard, who will be chairing. Thank you.